Official death toll rises in Sierra Leone after mudslides killed hundreds of people. Is this a case of an unavoidable natural disaster or government neglect? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is Sierra Leone's mudslides. First, the land beneath our feet trembled, then water rushed down, and finally, we saw the mountain coming down around us. That was how one person in Sierra Leone described the mudslides that instantly wiped out generations of families. As I speak, 499 people are confirmed dead. More than 600 are still missing. And the government says rescue teams are unlikely to find any more survivors. To say this is a tragedy is an understatement, but others have another word for it: neglect. Mount Sugarloaf, where the mudslides took place, has undergone years of illegal deforestation. So we're asking, could the government have put forward regulations that might have saved the lives of hundreds of people? In a moment, we'll pose that question to Sierra Leone's presidential spokesman. But first, this report from Basil Rehan.
Came without warning to this community on the outskirts of Sierra Leone's capital. A landslide caused by torrential rain and flash flooding, leaving behind a devastating aftermath. More than 600 people are still missing, and this mass burial was held last week. A hurried operation to deal with the nearly 500 dead recovered so far. More than 20,000 people have been displaced, and there are concerns that corpses buried under the mud may contaminate local water supplies and create an epidemic of waterborne disease. Relief agencies have so far been able to manage the crisis with some international aid, but resources are running out.
They need blankets, they need used clothing or even unused clothing. We need to bring these things here. We need shoes on their feet. We need a lot of things.
And there is increasing frustration and growing criticism that this disaster should never have happened.
I am very disturbed by this national tragedy.
President Ernest Koroma was quick to express his condolences to victims. But critics say this disaster was preventable. A result of the government's lax enforcement of Sierra Leonean laws that block developers from building on protected areas. Illegal housing is common in Freetown. Much of it is built on the hillside surrounding the densely populated capital, causing deforestation and increasing the risk of landslides, putting thousands of people at risk. As the dust settles from this disaster, many wonder whether the Sierra Leonean government will be willing to take the steps necessary to protect its people and prevent a repeat of the tragedy. Basil Rehan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Freetown is Sierra Leone's presidential spokesman, Abdoulaye Baraitai. And from London is Mike Noyes, the head of humanitarian response at ActionAid, an international organization working to end poverty. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Baraitai, if I can begin with you first, sir. As the spokesman for the President, Ernest Bai Koroma, what is your message to the families who have lost their loved ones and to the survivors?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to further reiterate our profound condolences, which we've already expressed to the people of this country. The President also declared a 7-day mourning that just ended last Monday, and we still continue to mourn. And the President, on a daily basis, continues to visit the affected communities with a view to provide empathy to the people, recognizing that the tragedy that befell this country, we have never witnessed such a tragedy in just one day. A country that has endured a civil war, a country that has gone through the scourge of Ebola, but in just one day, whereby over 400 of our compatriots were buried. It was a very emotional scene as the entire country was in mourning. But again, As a country, we are a very resilient people. We buried our loved ones, but we never buried our hopes. That were exactly the words of President Nkrumah, and that is why the people of this country continue to support the government in its efforts to make sure we do a safe and dignified location to places that we have identified. The government has allocated 200 acres of land, and construction work for 52 model houses of 2 bedrooms each have just commenced this morning as I am speaking to you.
So, and that's great that you talk about this relocation. You mentioned the word safe, and this is very important. And of course, from the outset, our sincere condolences to all your countrymen. A terrible tragedy, and Sierra Leoneans are a resilient people. But why wasn't this done before? This is an allocated protected area. According to your law, the Western Area Forest Reserve, people are not supposed to live there. They're not supposed to live in this vulnerable place. Why were they living there? Why was there no safety mechanism? Why wasn't there anyone preventing them? Why were there no standards? Why were they there in the first place? In order to face the mudslides, to face the rocks, to face the water, to face everything crashing down on them. Why, sir?
I think that has been the question that many people have been asking. And for us, though, as a government and as a people, we started the demolition of houses in areas that have been declared to be disaster-prone areas. And it didn't just come overnight. Since 2015, when we had the flooding in Freetown, we allocated a place called 6 Mile, which is in the outskirts of the city, and we relocated people there. Eventually, others came back to the areas that were affected, and we did this with the support of our partners at the time, and eventually, it was also in the middle of the fight against the Ebola, so the government was overstretched with resources. But we resumed again just a couple of months ago, the reminders to the public that they should not live in these areas. In fact, the Sugarloaf community at region that is most affected, just 2 weeks ago prior to the disaster itself, members of the protected area of agency went there to effect a tree planting program, and they were chased out by the community. For us, though, we are not apportioning blame for now. Years back, also one of our lands officials who went to enforce the law was chased by the community. He was taken to a nearby forest, his eyes gouged, and eventually he was brutally killed. But as I said, for now, we are concentrating on the victims and the affected. But the president has given decisive instructions
certainly.
that the 200 acres allocated.
Again, I'm sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you. This might sound to others from the outside watching, and I have no doubt that this is true, the guy's eyes getting gouged and so on. This might sound as if you're victim blaming, because it's a government responsibility to enforce the laws. People are not supposed to live there. They are, they were, they died. Tens of thousands are displaced. 500 people are dead. And you're saying the people didn't want to move. It sounds as if you're victim blaming. Can you understand how it sounds, how it looks?
We are not blaming anybody, and we have reiterated that many a time. For now, the collective effort of every Sierra Leonean, because government has also been indicted, that afterwards we have used the carrot, it is time to use the stick. And we are very mindful of the ILO Convention on the Relocation of People, with particular reference to Article 169, whereby we have to relocate people. First, we get their consent, and secondly, if they are living within disaster-prone areas, how do we make sure we relocate them, taking into consideration their livelihood, etc.? And I just mentioned in my introductory remarks that the government was very much overstretched because of the outbreak of Ebola, because we started the relocation in 2015, which was in the middle of Ebola. But when our economy became devastated as a consequence, this is where we recommence the process. But as I'm speaking to you now, our focus as a government and as a people is to continue to request the support of the international community to come to our aid. That way we'll be able to have a lasting solution to these disaster-prone areas.
Okay, and that's a good opportunity to bring in Mike Noyes. Mike Noyes, what does Sierra Leone need from the international community to, first of all, find any more survivors if they are? And I know it's getting very, very unlikely right now, but more than 600 are still missing. Is there an opportunity for some outside help to help find and save people? And also beyond that, what needs to be done and who needs to help?
ActionAid has been working with the government of Sierra Leone and other relief agencies since the very onset of this disaster. And like the presidential spokesperson, we'd also like to share our condolences and our sympathy and support for the families of those most affected. I think realistically, a week after the earthquake, there's probably very little chance that any search and rescue is likely to bring back further survivors. What I've seen, what my colleagues on the ground of Sierra Leone have told me, reminds me very much of a situation after an earthquake, say, such as the one in Haiti. So what is needed right now is sort of immediate support for the families of the survivors, the families of those most affected, and indeed the families of those, as the presidential spokesperson has been saying, who will have to be temporarily evacuated or even permanently moved because of further risks such as this. Mm-hmm. In the long term, I think we need to look, as we always do in these circumstances, about how further events can be prevented. You've mentioned a lot of things about safe building codes and the like, and they're all very important. What we do know is in the sense that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. An earthquake or a landslide in an empty area doesn't affect anyone. It's the presence of human beings in those places that creates the disaster, as we've seen here and seen the impact we've seen here. So I think, in Sierra Leone, as the government spokesperson has been saying, we are seeing a situation where the country faces now and in the past multiple challenges, and it does have to do some work on prioritising them. I think it's quite understandable that, Ebola has been a major priority in the past few years, and that we shouldn't underestimate the impact that had on Sierra Leonean society and on Sierra Leonean economy. So even before this landslide, there was a massive call on the international community that did come in solidarity during the crisis of Ebola to continue that solidarity for the reconstruction.
You've mentioned that there's no such thing as a natural disaster because a mudslide or a landslide in an empty area kills nobody. With that in mind, would you use the word neglect when it comes to the government and how prepared they were or ill-prepared they were for this to happen?
I think it's very easy to be wise after the event. It's very easy to say all the things that could be done. I think what is important is to think about how further tragedies of this kind can be prevented in Sierra Leone and elsewhere. I don't think it's particularly helpful to look at a government in a country like Sierra Leone because, frankly, what underlines the causes of these disasters in so many cases is poverty. Mm-hmm. It's poverty that forces people to live on marginal lands. It's poverty and a lack of livelihoods and such that leads people to cut down trees on hillsides where they can't and such like. It's not simply a problem of policing. It's a problem of development.
Right. Now, certainly, but this also happens in rich countries, as we saw with Katrina and so on. We ask questions afterwards and ask if it can be prevented. Let's move on a little bit now. Mr. Baraitai, what is the government doing to prevent the spread of disease now? Because I'm reading that cholera is a big worry.
Well, it is a major concern for us right now. So what we have done is the Ministry of Health and Sanitation has deployed on the ground in particularly the affected communities. They have done some decontamination, and also UNICEF, one of our development partners, they have trained quick intervention people there, and they have also been deployed so that they can be on the ground advising people the do's and the don'ts to prevent cholera. Just last week, we had a scare, but after laboratory tests, it proved to be negative for cholera. So we are stepping up the campaign. Every year, usually, this is the time when we contend with cholera cases. But we are very hopeful that, and very good for now, that we haven't reported any case. And this is where WHO, the government mainline ministries, as well as UNICEF, they are now on the ground to put in measures in place to make sure we don't get any double jeopardy. That whilst we are dealing with this disaster, we also have cholera on top of it. That will just overstretch us as a nation.
Mr. Baratai, if I give you the opportunity to address the international community, our international viewership, tell them what you need.
Right now, we are continuing the registration of our people. We have people living in shelters right now that are being constructed because schools are going to be disinfected as they are going to open in the next couple of weeks. We need shelter materials. We need blankets. We need medical supplies, particularly antibiotics. But above all, we needed the support this time, not for just a quick fix of our challenges we have. The government policy is to relocate these people to Mile 6 with a provision of 200 acres of land. The more they can come, already Sierra Leoneans have taken the bull by the horns. They have started constructing 52 two-bedroom houses that they are going to donate free to the government. There is going to be a clinic, a hospital, water facilities. And this is where we continue to appeal for international support, because Sierra Leone had supported other countries in the past. When Haiti, that is far away, in 2009 with their earthquake, Sierra Leone supported very modestly with $100,000. When Mali, a neighboring country in the sub-region, was in crisis, Sierra Leone supported with $1 million. At the time, our economy was doing well. But now our economy was impacted negatively by the Ebola. We are just on the verge of recovery when this disaster struck. And this is where we want to continue to appeal. Even the international community working with their NGOs on the ground, let them synchronize with the government so that collectively we can put this thing behind us. But for now, we don't have any haphazard intervention. I think Sierra Leone deserves better, like any other country that may face a challenge of this nature.
Yeah, strongly put. Mike, you mentioned you saw parallels with what happened in Haiti. In the aftermath of what happened in Haiti with that earthquake, we saw a lot of mismanagement. Sometimes it was just a downright mess when it came to the disaster response and the rebuilding in the aftermath. What sort of lessons can you draw from that experience and hope not to repeat when it comes to Sierra Leone?
I think there's some very clear lessons, certainly around coordination and leadership, and I think it's very pleasing to see how in this particular set of circumstances the government of Sierra Leone and its ministries have built on their experience in responding to Ebola as well as what we've seen elsewhere, and have taken a clear lead in coordination and in organising the disaster response. I think that's a very good step. I think in terms of the work that needs to be done on long-term reconstruction, yes, surely there are lessons to be learnt in terms of where buildings are located, and there's always a challenge with that in that you can locate, as people tried to do in Haiti, say after the earthquake, in very safe areas, but very safe areas that are miles from where their livelihoods are, miles from where their families are, miles from where their opportunities are, and people won't go to them. So understanding not just the technical aspects, but understanding the human and social aspects, and understanding the needs of people, understanding particularly the needs of women, the needs of families, the needs of children, in designing a response, and it not being simply an urban planning fix, I think is quite important. And I am confident that the government of Sierra Leone, working with organisations such as my own organisation, ActionAid, has learnt much and is ready for this sort of challenge.
Gentlemen, I'm glad we've had this conversation. I've got to move on, but terrible time for the people of Sierra Leone. We wish them maximum power, maximum strength. Thank you very much for joining us, Abdoulaye Baratai and Mike Noyes. Bye-bye. Coming up, why the debate over Confederate statues is not just about America's racist past. And I speak to a 94-year-old war veteran who says we're on the cusp of World War III. What began as peaceful demonstrations in the U.S. state of Arizona ended with protesters choking on tear gas and police dodging glass bottles. For a second week in a row, chaos hit the streets of a major American city, all to oppose white supremacy. When it was in Charlottesville, Virginia, activists targeted a rally in support of Confederate statues. Now their anger is aimed at U.S. President Donald Trump, who many accuse of coming down on the wrong side of the debate.
A campaign-style rally for US President Donald Trump.
What a crowd!
His first event since the deadly clashes in Charlottesville last week.
What happened in Charlottesville strikes at the core of America. And tonight, this entire arena stands united in forceful condemnation of the thugs who perpetrate hatred and violence.
Hundreds of white supremacists and neo-Nazis had descended on Charlottesville to protest against the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. They were met by counter-protests. Several people were injured, and one woman was killed when a man rammed his car into the crowd. Trump was criticised for not immediately condemning the white supremacists. At this rally, he reread some of his statements to the crowd, but left out his controversial claim that many sides were to blame for the violence, and doubled down on his criticism of the press.
The only people giving a platform to these hate groups is the media itself and the fake news.
But outside, hundreds had gathered to protest against the event and to confront the president's supporters. Police fired tear gas and stun grenades at the crowd. After reports, protesters were throwing rocks and bottles. Trump has been accused of inciting or failing to discourage far-right hate speech and violence. And the apparent emboldening of white supremacist groups has redrawn the battle lines of a culture war it was thought was already won. This was the catalyst for violence in Charlottesville. To some, a proud symbol of Southern history. To many others, a symbol of enslavement and oppression. After Charlottesville, several states have brought forward plans to take down statues, some removing them in the middle of the night. There's also been debate about whether schools named after Confederate leaders should change their names, like Stonewall Jackson School in Virginia. But for many, this is being seen as an attack on their history and culture, and political correctness gone too far. And it seems the US president agrees.
It's time to challenge the media for their role in fomenting divisions. And yes, by the way, they are trying to take away our history and our heritage. You see that.
But are these monuments about honouring history, or are they a tool to justify and maintain racist beliefs?
To me, it's very simple. A guy that gave his life, quite literally, to the enslavement of a race to prevent them from all sorts of things, including an education, should not have a school named after him.
Is removing these Confederate symbols the right solution? Or will hiding these reminders of history's horrors risk history repeating itself? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
To get more on this, let's go to our panel. From New York, Republican political analyst Gianno Caldwell. From Cambridge, England, Chris McGovern is the chairman of the Campaign for Real Education. And from Washington, Jasmine El-Gamal. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thanks all of you for joining us. Gianno, let me start with you. Do you believe that these statues need to come down?
Well, I think it's a local rule. These statues obviously have become very divisive on both sides of the issue. You got the statues that were erected between the late 1800s to 1920s, which in a lot of cases people believe that they furthered white supremacy. Obviously, the Confederacy was to preserve slavery And that's why they went to war. They obviously lost. So the question then becomes, why would we be putting up statues in some view of celebrating history of a losing team, if you will? So it's almost like a participation trophy in my view. I think that statues absolutely have a place in museums. I don't know if them being in 33 states, including the District of Columbia, is the most important or rather condign measure unless they're in a museum. At the end of the day, I think it's local rule. The people decide in their local communities whether they want these statues up or not.
Okay, Chris McGovern, doesn't that all sound very reasonable? Put them in museums, don't have them outside.
Well, yes, and the point which has been made is that this should be decided democratically. I mean, undoubtedly, history defines our identity, and the statues, to some extent, are the signposts of history. Look, if you walk into the British Museum in London, the first figure you see is an equestrian statue of the Emperor Augustus. He was in control of the Roman Empire, which was built on slavery. If you go to northern Britain, you see Hadrian's Wall. It's a monument to Roman power. It was built on slavery. Do we want to get rid of it? No, we don't, because we're rather proud of our Roman background. These matters should be decided locally, and it's important that people have a voice. But I would also say that once you have this as an issue, it divides people. There's a big danger of polarizing society and leading to even violence on the streets, as we saw in the United States. It's a very difficult situation. It has to be done by compromise and by agreement and by democracy.
Jasmine, this conversation is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a time when American society is deeply polarized. We've got neo-Nazis on the streets. We have people who are very angry about this. What do you think is the best thing to do right now? Should these statues be torn down, Jasmine?
I think I agree with both of the panelists about the fact that this has to be decided democratically and locally, and about the fact that it's important to preserve our history, as awful as our history can be sometimes. One of the things that's at the heart of this debate, the issues, is that there is a portion of our population that has suffered and continues to suffer horrible injustice. Their ancestors were bought and sold and enslaved and denied any rights whatsoever for a really long time. And these statues represent that. They represent the subjugation of African Americans. That is a fact. Now, as a fellow American, as their fellow Americans, why would we want statues up there that remind them of that every single day? That is the conversation that we need to be having. When people say that we need to preserve our culture and to preserve our history and that we shouldn't tear these statues down, we should listen to them. They are making a point. We may not agree with it, but they are making a point, and that point needs to be part of the discussion. The question is, can we agree on the fact that these statues represent a really painful part of our history for certain people in our country? And then can we try to think about what to do about it going forward in a way that preserves our history, again, both the good and the bad, but in a way that's also respectful.
Now, usually they say there's a tweet for everything when it comes to President Donald Trump. There's a tweet regarding this as well. Let's have a little look at what he had to say. There was a little thread from him. He said, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson, so foolish. Also the beauty that has been taken out of our cities, towns and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced." Let me ask you, Giano, I'm presuming you didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. How do you feel about the president?
Well, that's a fact.
Yes, how do you feel about the president taking this side? You voted for him. He's taking the side of, in the context of this discussion, some guys who are nostalgic for a past, including lynching black people, and among those crowds, people saying, "Hail Hitler." How do you feel about that as a Republican?
Well, first and foremost, I never said who I voted for, but I certainly didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, but my vote is private. How do I feel about President Trump's commentary on this issue, especially when you're talking about folks like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, folks who actually were founders of our country, founders of the Declaration of Independence? I understand why they have statues. It makes sense to me. There was more than just them being slave owners. The Confederacy was about a very specific issue. It was about white supremacy. It was about furthering the narrative of black marginalization. These statues, especially went up during the height of Jim Crow, where we were talking about the real marginalization of black people. President Trump and I disagree on a number of issues, whether it be the statues, which in my view, it's not that we should keep tear down every statue that we see. It's just that it should be in a place where it can be respected from a historic standpoint, and that is in a museum. I was disappointed with what I saw in Charlottesville with the president not that long ago. I was disappointed with his commentary. I had a very emotional response to it. But nonetheless, when it comes to the statues, I think that there's a lot of passion on both sides of the issues, and I think there's not enough of us listening to each other to fully understand the argument. I think what we can all agree on, that this is a historic piece of our country. I would also agree with it's something in which we should recognize and take thought of. But we also should further and do what Vice President Pence said. Add some more statues. I would say add Nat Turner, who was a very well-known pastor during the slave movement. He also led the slave rebellion in Virginia. Why don't we put up statues of him? He added a great deal of history to our country. So if we're going to put up statues of people who lost the war, let's put up statues of people who led to progress beyond the war and slavery. That's what I think we should do.
Chris, you're all in agreement that this should be decided locally and democratically. And this is the vibe I'm getting from all of you. Let me ask you then, Chris, about a specific. Do you think it was wrong for the mayor of Baltimore to order the removal of 4 Confederate statues? There was no vote. There was no consensus. The mayor of Baltimore said, hey, we're going to take these down, and overnight, these went. They're not put in museums. They've been taken down. What do you think, Chris? Was that wrong?
I think it was wrong. I think it was provocative because it was undemocratic. We have the same situation, in a sense, developing in the UK, where yesterday there was a call for the statue of Nelson, the great British hero, to be pulled down from Trafalgar Square. And I think quite a few people, both in the States and to some extent in Europe, are concerned that maybe the argument over statues will continue beyond where it may be legitimate to pull statues down, to pulling down the markers of national identity. Nelson's an interesting one, and I think he's so important in British history. Yes, he may have been sympathetic to slavery, as was George Washington, but he's so important. We don't think we should be pulling him down. But I agree with the previous speaker. Maybe we should be erecting statues. And in Trafalgar Square, I would like to see a statue of the African Emperor of Britain, who no one knows about. He was a Roman. He came from North Africa. He came to Britain, and he enslaved the British. I'm very happy to see the African Emperor of Britain in Trafalgar Square, who enslaved the British, because he's part of our history. He helps to define our culture. He's important. So statues do matter. But I don't think we want to go along the situation we're having in America, which is obviously on the edge of violence. We have seen terrible violence. The same situation is arising in Europe. There is a concern in Britain that maybe things are spilling out from the USA to Europe, and maybe things will get out of control, and that a lot of statues will have to go. It will cause division. It will cause problems on the streets.
Jasmine, when people say a lot of statues have to go, I've heard this slippery slope argument before, and I mean, it's been rooted in fact as well. I mean, in a place like South Africa, after the statue of Cecil John Rhodes went down, there were people calling for Gandhi's statue to come down because Gandhi said some terrible things about black people as well. So even Gandhi, history shows, wasn't a perfect person, right? And there are those who say, well, it's a slippery slope, so who gets to decide? Should we just tear down the statues of everybody? Do you find that argument valid and relevant, Jasmine?
Well, I think you asked the perfect question, which is who gets to decide, right? So the president of the University of Texas at Austin recently sent out an email that talked about his decision and his thought process and what he did to address the issue of statues on their campus. And he ends the email with something that I thought was quite powerful. And he says, you know, we don't choose our history, but we can choose what to honor and who to honor and how. But he did it in a very democratic manner. He put together a panel of alumni and students and all different kinds of people to talk about this issue. And so I think, again, to come back to the point of doing this in a democratic fashion, you know, I've lived and worked across the world in countries that were not democratic. And my background is in radicalization and extremism. And one of the things that contributes to radicalization is when people feel like they don't have a voice. And that's what happens in undemocratic countries, is that often people don't have a voice and they feel very frustrated because they feel like their side of the story is not getting a chance to be aired, and that's not fair. And so we live in a democracy. That's what makes us so great, and that's an advantage that we should use in this conversation and in this debate right now. So when you say who gets to decide, the American people get to decide, and more specifically, local populations get to decide based on their historical context, their part of the Civil War, and their circumstances today. And so taking down statues undemocratically, taking down statues on a whim is not the answer. And it does lead to a slippery slope, because then you have people all over the country, governors, mayors, whoever makes those decisions, that can just do whatever they see fit. And that can cause
Jasmine,
more problems than it solves.
Sorry to come in there, but when a mob goes and takes down the statue of Saddam Hussein, or mobs take down a statue of Stalin, or a statue of Lenin in Eastern Europe, or the former Soviet Union, it's never seen as, oh, this is worrying, it's a slippery slope, it's undemocratic. It's seen as this expression of emancipation by people. Why isn't it seen as the same in the United States when a group wants to take down a Confederate statue, Jasmine?
Well, you know, I think, first of all, I always hesitate to make comparisons with other countries because everybody's different and the context is different. For people who, you know, I was in Iraq during the war, and I saw people taking down statues, and I saw, you know, children in schools taking down pictures of Saddam Hussein that had been placed there against their will, and it was a cathartic moment for them. But you have to remember, you know, Saddam Hussein was a tyrant who gassed and killed and maimed thousands, hundreds of thousands of his people. Not to minimize what happened in our country, but the fact is our country is a democracy. We have a process for these things. We have order. We have an opportunity to give everybody a voice at the table and to do this in a democratic, well thought out way that takes everybody's feelings into account. I'm not saying that what they did in Iraq or other countries was wrong. I'm just saying that's not us and that's not who we are right now, and everything has to be taken in context.
Giano, things have been bubbling for a while. We saw with Dylan Roof, when he shot up those innocent people in a church a couple of years ago. We saw the debate over the Confederate flag because he was pictured with the Confederate flag. He was also pictured with the old flag of Rhodesia, the apartheid South Africa flag. There was the debate over whether to take those down. There's a debate now over the statues. Symbols, these symbols that mean a lot to your country. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. We're talking about flags and statues, Giano, but of course we're not really talking about these things. We're talking about things that are far deeper and far more meaningful. Are you worried right now in the year 2017? We're in the second half of the year 2017. Are you worried with where the United States is with this president at this moment in time, and as some would call it, the culture wars are playing out in the country?
Well, here's my final thought, because I know the segment is ending. I am concerned with the way President Trump has handled race relations in America. I don't believe that he understands race relations. I don't believe that he understands the history as well as he should, or the sensitivity around the issues. Certainly statues and Confederate flags and whatever else have you are symbols, but sometimes they're very cherished symbols by folks, which in a view of many, these symbols have been used as weapons of hate. And I'm disappointed that many Americans have not understood this issue or capitulated to that reality just yet, that even if you cherish something, you got to understand its history and what it's been used at, even if you disagree. So you at least need the sensitivity around that issue. There's some folks within the administration who seem to understand and have the right tone and tenor when it comes to these issues. I think VP Pence is an individual who I can say is probably that from what I've seen thus far. I think that there's a necessary, there's a need for a national dialogue on race in this country, similar to what then Senator Obama did in 2008 after the Goddamn America speech came, which was his pastor, Reverend Wright, who came out with some really radical speech. And he had to speak to race. Then Senator Obama had to speak to race very, very directly. I think that's necessary at this point in time in our culture and our history. in our moment. And I'm just in this wait and see moment because there's a lot of folks in our country that have some very interesting thoughts, but how many of them will feel or rather understand the sensitivities around these issues and be able to speak to them in a very direct manner? I don't know. So there's a concern there, but I'm hopeful that in this country that there's folks that are going to stand out and speak up.
Okay. I'm glad you all took the time to talk to us, Janu Caldwell, Chris McGovern, and Jasmine El-Gamal. It's been great to talk to all of you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks.
After Britain struggled and endured the horrors and deprivations of the Second World War, the citizens of our country created a social revolution. But now Britain and other Western nations have started to turn their back on the idea of a civilized state with horrible results.
Harry Leslie Smith is the newest darling of leftist politics in Britain. At the ripe old age of 94, he's written several books on social justice, all in his 90s, has more than 100,000 followers on Twitter, a popular podcast, and contributes to several publications. But lately, this decorated World War II veteran is voicing a warning based on the past. He says he laughed at the prospect of a great war 80 years ago, but now he's scared that World War III will happen in the not-too-distant future. Well, let's ask the man himself why he thinks this. Harry Leslie Smith joins me now from Belleville, Ontario in Canada. Thanks so much for joining us, Harry. Now, you seem to be very worried for this generation and the generations to come. And what do you mean when you say, don't let my past become your future? What do you mean?
I mean that I'm dreadfully scared that my past, which was a bitter experience for all people in the Western world, because governments didn't care a damn about whether they lived or died. In fact, if you got ill in those early days in the early 30s, you simply died because you could not afford a doctor or a hospital or anything else. We have to ensure that everyone in all our Western countries pays their legitimate taxes, because without taxes, no government can create new hospitals or universities or schools. They must get people paying their fair share.
As someone who fought the Nazis during World War II, how did you feel when, at the age of 94, you saw Nazis on the streets of Charlottesville in the US?
It was inevitable. He felt that he could get away with anything. And it was only a few chosen people who made him regret that he didn't come out immediately and apologize for his attitude towards that particular incident. It's the U.S. is in a very crucial stage right now, and it could develop over the next 2 to 3 months, and we may be surprised at the results of what happens, whether Trump is going to be taken out and his vice president takes over. I don't know which will happen, but it assuredly will happen very, very soon.
Why do you think, sir, that your message resonates with so many young people? Because a lot of the mediums that you're using, you have your own podcast, Harry's Last Stand, you have your Twitter handle with more than 100,000 Twitter followers. A lot of young people are retweeting you, are engaging with you, are listening to what you have to say. What does that tell you? Did you expect this? Are you surprised?
I'm both surprised and happy, very, very happy about this. I think also it wasn't all just my doing. I think that Corbyn's success is due in part, in a huge part, to the young people who got behind him at the election and put him in the position he is in today. It is terrific. I endorse it, I love it, and I just can't wait to see our dear Elizabeth May take a tumble, because she is still from the old school of keep the people down and keep the Conservatives up, and that is no good for any country. Conservatism is dead as far as I'm concerned, and I will do my damnedest to make sure it stays dead.
But are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable with people seeing you as no more than a leftist activist? Because you've got a lot to contribute, you've got a lot to say about the world, and you've got a rich history and experience. Are you comfortable being boxed in as a leftist activist, a Corbyn supporter?
Most certainly. Where else can we go for justice? We have not too many alternatives, but my alternative, Corbyn, is the best, and I think the one that will prove of most benefit to our country. And not only our country, because whatever happens in Britain rapidly happens across the Western world. It's you know, I spend a lot of time in England, and what has happened in England should not happen to any country in any part of the world. I mean, when I see people who can't afford to rent a place to live and have to sleep on the streets in towns and cities in England, I think it's just an absolute terrible thing. And I could cry, believe me. There's these people holding out their hands, and these are people, young people, middle-aged people, all ages, sitting there. Now, surely we can't allow it. We must be able to do something better than that. I mean, after the Second World War, our government, we were massively in debt to the US of A and other countries for money we'd borrowed in order to fight Hitler. And even so, our government went out and they started building houses. First of all, for the ones that had been destroyed by Hitler, and secondly, the ramshackle homes of the North that had been the homes for millions for at least 40, 50 years. Those homes, believe me, that I lived in England in my youth and in my early boyhood were not fit to kennel a dog. Mm-hmm. It's time that we all got up off our hind legs and stood for what is right for all people, not just for the 10% or the 1%. They don't matter, because all they're interested in is how much money they can accumulate. And it seems to me they can have $40 billion, but it's never enough. I don't know where they think they're taking it when they leave this world, but they sure as hell can't take it with them, I know that. and all they'll start is a generation of their children who feel that they are better than everyone else.
Harry Leslie Smith, sir, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all for the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Next time, we explore Australia's unusual political crisis as more parliamentarians discover they've broken the law by unknowingly being dual citizens. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.